Are you seeing it now? I hope. I did this presentation a little bit to guide the conversation. So I'm Daniel. I'm an organization designer. My most recent project was facilitating the design and the launch of the Aragon Network DAO. And now I'm working on a few next ideas. And this is some thoughts that I have evolved over time that hopefully tie in very well to the conversation that we're just having. So when it comes to thinking about community contributors and incentives, I generally use this very, very simple model. Is obviously an oversimplification. But as people go from being outsiders to being more core contributors, generally we could say that they need to gain more context about what's going on so we can make informed decisions. They need to earn the trust of the other people around, so they get influence and are allowed to play, allowed to participate. And then we also need to increase commitment, so there is some level of continuity over time, and we don't lose too much organizational knowledge and so on. And so as we're thinking about these, let me go. The incentives and the tools that we have for these, the most common ones have been grants and bounties. And at least the reason why I think that's been the case is mostly that grant and bounties are really simple primitives to build. Is a one-off transaction. We just give someone a pot of money for a piece of work that has been clearly defined. So when we're still not very decentralized, still don't have a lot of more complex systems for collective intelligence, collective sense-making, for collective strategizing, for all of these other things, essentially when the community is still at these early stages, this idea where we can still have a lot of control on what gets funded and what gets incentivized is fairly comfortable. And so we start with grant and bounties. But I would say that also there is a cultural perspective that comes from, let's say, the situation where most of the DAO creators, DAO originators have historically come from, that they come from North America, Western Europe in general, like places where there is a significant level of wealth. And in general, we can see that most DAO creators, most DAO contributors, they have many months of funding available for them, or many months of savings. So they're not, let's say, compared to the broader population, it's a generally wealthy and privileged population, well-educated, and has the chance to go into this space and learn a lot of things. And so there are also some bias that come from both let's say, the cultural origins that these people have, as well as the socioeconomic situation. And I'm not fully excluding myself from this, but to dig a little bit into that, there is some research on different polarities in which we can classify cultures, and a lot of research has been done onto this. And one of the 8 core dimensions on one particular framework that I like is the difference in between task-based cultures and relationship-based cultures. So in a task-based culture, we tend to give trust to people because they have the skills to complete a task. So these are professional cultures where, like, being on time, being professional is valued, and is generally a sign of respect to other people. And then there is more relationship-based cultures where the emphasis is more on having a positive experience. And in these situations, you can have a quote, for example, of this is an example of a manufacturing company in the US going to China to try to do some things over there. And so they're meeting the Chinese team, and the Chinese host is opening the meeting by saying, if over the next 2 days, we don't accomplish anything other than getting to know each other, we could still think that this has been extraordinarily successful. And so their American counterparts are like, wait, what do you mean during the next 2 days, we're not gonna achieve anything? That sounds kind of weird. We're just gonna be building relationships. That kind of jars. And so in this polarity, we have, like in the opposite left side, we have the USA, Denmark, Netherlands, Finland, Germany, Austria, Poland, the UK, and so on. And you can see, like, a lot of us tend to come from these geographies. Well, myself, I'm half Colombian, half Belgian, so it's a little bit mixed. But then increasingly, we're having people from cultures that come more from relationship-based cultures that are joining into this space. And the way they think about it, the way they feel about it might be significantly different. But my point is more that if we can generally say that most people who have entered this space in the early stages are kind of on this left side of the spectrum, there is probably a bias that we are going to have for task-based cultures, and generally a bias for thinking about DAOs in a very task-based, task-oriented way. And it's not only about the culture; it's also like trying to escape the mainstream, having the possibility to be rewarded for the value we do. So there is like also this contrast in between the in between the need for fairness and autonomy that has been very, very prevalent on the community, and then on the other side, the need for safety and certainty. And so on the left side, we can sort of like make a parallel here in between an orientation towards delivering value that has already been created. So we have tools like bounties, and you only get the bounty if you have created the value. Or equally tipping, you can tip someone when they have already provided some value, and otherwise they're not getting anything. There is some noise there in the background. Sorry, if someone was speaking, I have no idea what that was.
We are taking care.
Okay, thank you.
Just go ahead.
Okay, cool. So then we have like mechanisms like praise, like maybe source cred, and this is not like a perfect mapping. You can also use some of these mechanisms to reward things that could be more oriented towards the relationship or more oriented towards ongoing commitment. But in general terms, they tend to be more focused on rewarding a specific artifact or a specific action or a specific contribution that someone has done. And generally, like the contracting, the way to think about the relationship here is very, very small. Like in the bounties, is like you create these, I don't know, you write this article, and in exchange of that, you get this amount of funding. So it's a very short-term contract. And then on the opposite end of the scale, we have more the salaries, or perhaps the endowments we can even think about. But in the salary, you're rewarding people for just contributing to a stream of work, and it's not, you have some definitions of what that means, but you're not really focusing on the specific items, and people will be getting that salary whether they deliver the specific items or not. Obviously, like if they're not delivering any value, there's going to come a point where that salary gets cut off. But there is also like the perspective of the contributor, where, as I was saying, they need a little bit of safety. And we have a lot of people who come to DAOs and they're like, well, I can only contribute part-time. And that's usually the journey where people start becoming DAO contributors, is they find 2 free DAOs where they contribute part-time. And then eventually when they realize that, yes, they can make a living, yes, they can earn enough and so on, then they can switch to making it more full-time. But that still requires having that sort of safety net that many people don't have. And so in contrast with that, I've been trying to think, okay, so how do we approach these polarities? Is there a way in which we can have both the safety and the certainty, like the safety for the contributor, also the certainty for the organization and so on, to be able to manage the relationship and knowing that they're just not paying money to a whole bunch of anonymous people who are not contributing any value and nothing is happening. And then on the other side, also have a good sense of fairness and a good sense of autonomy and the flexibility and so on that are such fantastic characteristics of DAOs when they're well designed. And so thankfully, this is not necessarily a new problem. It's been going on for a while. There's many organizations who've been trying to figure out this through time. And there is a few interesting case studies that we can learn from. And one of my favorite is Hire. So Hire is a huge IoT organization. They have something like 70,000 contributors. They're a Chinese organization, so an organization very steeped in a relationship-oriented culture. And Hire, which started as a very classic manufacturing, very pyramid sort of organization, traditional culture, top-down, and all of that, realized at some point that IoT was going to be a thing, and they had no idea what IoT was going to look like. They just knew it was a new thing. So there was a lot of uncertainty in the future, and their answer trying to figure out, okay, so how do we organize ourselves when there is no clarity at all what our strategy should be or could be, as this is a completely new space and everything still needs to be invented. So their thinking goes like, well, the people who are really good at navigating uncertainty are entrepreneurial teams. So how can we make everyone into an entrepreneur? And so they decide to become this sort of platform for micro enterprises and enable all their huge, big monolithic business units to break down into smaller teams, each with their own profit and loss, each with their own budget based on either achieving outcomes or mostly through selling products and services to the other teams. So they create this marketplace, internal marketplace, and they invested a whole bunch of money, like millions and millions of dollars, trying to develop this structure. Now, interestingly, in their approach, and now what we can do with DAOs is kind of like off the shelf, have the tools to be able to deploy these en masse and with even more flexibility than they have. But one of the interesting approaches that they taken is that a very significant portion of the compensation that they are using is based on the performance indicators or achieving certain tasks and so on. So it's kind of like value delivery oriented. But there is also another part of the compensation that follows a little bit the logic of an UBI. So as long as you have contributed to a role, as long as you have had a role that you have committed to in the past 3 months and you've been executing in that role and so on, you will have a minimum salary that covers your basic expenses. So that means that you can have more flexibility as you take on roles, leave roles, and so on, and reorient yourself within the organization, which enables people to swap teams, to move across, to start new teams, to have a lot more freedom and more of a safety net to essentially experiment, fail, learn from those experiments, and keep on experimenting, as opposed to being stuck and just holding to what they already know is working, but could not necessarily make a 10x in value contribution for everyone. So having that safety net enables them to add a lot more flexibility into the structure while also ensuring that they can provide some safety and that people remain committed to the organization. So taking from that idea, and in Web3, that becomes even more important because everyone is looking for talent. If you can find enough Solidity devs, you're probably going to make it really big, because that on itself is a huge limiting factor for many people, or a really good community builder is really hard to find, and so on. Onboarding is hard. Like, there is a whole bunch of people who are coming. It can be a mess of information to join a DAO and so on. Everyone has too many options. There's a million different Discord servers, a million different conversations on Twitter, on Telegram, and so on. And the only certainty that we have is really change, because if you take a 1-month holiday, you're going to come back and the industry is going to look fairly different. So for these conditions and kind of like this situation, this shape that the industry has right now, being able to find a balance and offer people a little bit of certainty, a little bit of a safety net, is likely to provide us with the ability to onboard a whole host of potential contributors that would otherwise really struggle to participate in DAOs. So it can really help with inclusivity, it could really help with diversity, it could really help with narrowing down economic differences across geographies and so on. And the idea then comes to, can we create a sort of minimum viable salary system in that, as long as people are contributing enough, and this is not to replace the task-based contributions, but strike a balance in between the multiple reward mechanisms. And this way, we value the commitment that people are making, in the sense that it is ongoing as long as they keep on showing up to some degree, because they have said, yes, I'm going to take this role, I'm going to take this responsibility. We value that. So we value the relationship that we have with them. We value that human trust that has been built, as well as valuing the knowledge that has already been deposited in them, in the sense that without this, if we look at the other scenario, and maybe there is a contributor who has done 100 bounties, doing those bounties, sure, they get paid for each bounty, but also they accumulate a whole bunch of organizational knowledge about what's going on, who's doing what, and so on. And that's valuable, especially as you try to scale the organization and onboard other people and so on. So these mechanisms that enabling people to kind of graduate from being a pure bounty hunter or a pure ad hoc contributor and start to bridge the gap to the core team by offering them a minimum viable salary that depends perhaps on achieving a specific threshold on the other contributions. Or otherwise, we can find a sort of grant mechanism to offer scholarships for people who are saying, well, I cannot afford to join that way, or maybe I'm a high profile contributor and my time is very much on demand, but I'm going to bypass that system and join the crowd of my minimum viable salary contributors directly. So you can have two pathways, one where the people kind of earn their way up to the point where they can reach this stage, and then they're valued for the community for continuity, for the work they have done in the past, and assuming that they're going to continue to do that. And then a parallel system where people can perhaps bypass the other stages and directly get here. So we can include the variety of cases that would not really fall into the other system. Or anyway, that's kind of the idea that I've been playing around, that I want to experiment with. So this doesn't quite exist yet, although we have a lot of different tools. So if you're interested to help me out, I'm going to run a Gitcoin grant as an experiment to see if there is community demand, and I'll be announcing that over the next few days. And if not, hopefully you have found this interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, for this presentation. We have 2 minutes left, so I just pick one question from the chat. With the minimum viable, now it's jumped away. Minimum viable salary harm contributors from earning more than this base?
More than this base, you said? Sorry, more than this
More
base.
than this base income.
No, I mean, the idea is very much to combine these with other reward mechanisms. So the two work together. And right. This is more about like, well, on one side is, again, as I was saying, kind of like valuing the commitment, the trust, and so on, but also all the other intangibles that somehow are very hard to define by the other reward mechanisms. Like if we look at a lot of the peer-to-peer mechanisms, maybe those who are more introverted or those who are doing emotional labor that tends to be more kind of one-on-one and on private chats and so on, these kind of things sometimes are undervalued. So these can also help to address that a little bit. I'm not saying is going to solve the whole problem, but it can help with that. And then combined with more task-based incentives, you can essentially define how much you attribute to each of the mechanisms. And that way you calibrate it for your specific community based on the cultural preference and based on the sort of behaviors that you're seeing in the day-to-day, and then incentivize more or less one type of the other.
All right, thanks, Daniel.
Oh, let me answer just a quick one. Someone
100%.
Someone asking what context means, and context, I mean mostly about the organization. So is knowing who's doing what's going on, but also is context about the specific market. Like when you join a new job, usually after 3 months, you're kind of like an expert on that industry, or at least that sort of problem, not only like what your organization is doing, but also what a lot of other competitors or other organizations in the same space are sort of doing. And all of that learning is what I mean by context.